It's Inappropriate Characters.
Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And today, as usual, I am joined by Venger Satanis and by our own resident Doc Holiday, Grim Jim.
Hello.
Who may be coughing up a storm over the course of tonight's show.
For which I apologize. I'll try to mute as much as possible.
So today we're going to be talking about a variety of topics. And we're going to start out, before anything else, with the subject of the controversy around Frog God Games relating to their deal that they've made with Steve Jackson Games, who are producing the Fantasy Trip. Then there's a whole story behind that. I talked a little bit about it in my last video where I unboxed the amazing Legacy Edition box set of the Fantasy Trip that some absolute mad lad sent me. I don't know if it was someone from Steve Jackson Games or if it was a private citizen. It was basically impossible to know. And I don't know if somebody told me they were sending it. I must have forgotten because I had no idea it was coming. And it is quite the box set. If you're an OSR type of guy, if you know that you're going to like the Fantasy Trip, it's well worth it. But the point is that a bunch of SJWs brought up some old accounts about Webb's behavior. And now Webb's suing them. And that should be a lot of fun. Later on in the night, we're going to be changing topics into discussing a variety of things related to the craft of gaming, as it were, specifically about things like DMing styles and the question of realism in gaming and gaming worlds. But to start off, we're going to talk about this subject. For those of you who don't know, I mean, I'm guessing everybody watching knows what Steve Jackson Games is. They're a major game producer, and they make a lot of games that aren't RPGs. They've done Munchkin and Illuminati and stuff like that, Car Wars, Ogre. But they also were, they started out as an RPG company, and they produced GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system. But that was not Steve Jackson's first role-playing game. His original role-playing game was called the Fantasy Trip, and it was something that he produced for another company. And if you read the rules of the Fantasy Trip, it's like the proto version of GURPS. It was one of many old school RPGs that didn't really, in and of itself, there's nothing super amazing for it. Maybe one quality that it has is that, if I'm not mistaken, it was the very first role-playing game to do entirely point-by character creation instead of randomly generated character creation. Of course, in my perspective, that's not a plus, right? They're kind of responsible for a lot of issues there, from as far as I'm concerned. But if you like point-by, that's an interesting deal. But really, the thing that made the Fantasy Trip famous is that when the company went under, Steve Jackson didn't have the rights to that game, and he couldn't get them back until, I think, 2015 or 2017. So the game spent 35 years being out of print, and it basically became kind of one of the legends of old school gaming, right? This game that hasn't been around, unlike other old school games that continued to have an existence. So when he got the rights back, he started this big Kickstarter. It was extremely successful for Steve Jackson, and they produced this box set of the Fantasy Trip, which, again, an amazing looking box set. Check out my unboxing video on my channel. And they've been making further plans for the Fantasy Trip, including tie-ins. Now, this brings us to Frog God Games. Probably a lot of you in the audience will know about this, but in case you don't, Frog God is an important publisher in the OSR, the old school Renaissance. They've done Swords and Wizardry and other products. But of course, it's much smaller than Steve Jackson Games, which is one of the kind of the giants of the industry. But they've made an agreement with Steve Jackson Games where they're going to be including Fantasy Trip rules and stuff in their setting, in the default setting, that they have as a company that they use for their OSR products and things like that. So in this, they drew the attention of some of the usual suspects of the social justice crowd on account of the fact that there's an incident that happened, I think, a couple of years ago now.
Two years, I think.
There we go. So Bill Webb, who is the president of Frog God and the guy behind it, he there was some kind of an incident between him and a woman, which, depending on who you ask, was anything from he offered her a cigarette to he was drunk and hitting on her and continued to do so until someone physically stopped him or something like that. But in neither case was it anything more than that, right? Like it was basically, in the worst scenario possible, it was him acting like a drunken lout. Okay. And on account of this, of course, the SJW said that Frog God has to be completely destroyed. He should never work in the industry again. All of his products should be banned, et cetera, et cetera. So when they found out that Steve Jackson made a deal with Frog God, you had certain people, among them Christopher Helton, who is the wonderful piece of human garbage that made an article about me during Consultant Gate where he accused me of a bunch of things that were completely untrue. Then you had Stacey Delorfano, the person behind Contessa, who has recently basically attacked the entire OSR, called for the boycotting of Gary Cohn, done all kinds of social media assaults of accusing the entire old school movement of basically being, a bunch of Nazis or whatever. And the most famous one of all, Jessica Price, formerly of Paizo, who was famous for bringing social justice wokeness to Paizo, much to its detriment, until she either quit or got fired, depending on who you asked. And then she went on to this video game company where she terribly and publicly insulted some of the important clients of this company, and they fired her for it. And all three of the people...
Spencer as well, didn't she?
Sorry?
Yeah, Frank Spencer got skewered by her.
That's right.
Yeah.
She went after Frank. Yeah. So all three of these people were posting on Twitter. They were calling for boycotts. They were demanding that Steve Jackson Games immediately cancel any deal that they had with Frog God. And a couple of days ago, it came out that Bill Webb has decided to act on this. He's hired a lawyer named Ty Beard, who has already been experienced in previous cases of this sort about, dealing with SJW attacks on creative types. And it looks like these people are all going to get sued by Bill Webb via Ty Beard for tortious interference, which is to say that they were trying actively to interfere with a legal contract to try to harm that contract, which is, it's kind of especially for those of you who might not be from the United States, it's an odd sort of argument to make, because they're not saying Bill Webb didn't do it. They're not necessarily saying, these guys lied or anything like that. But what they're doing is they're going after the easiest case by which they can make a civil suit, which is that these people tried to break a contract that they weren't a part of. And that is a no-no in US civil law. And it's actionable. And these guys could be sued for a lot of money. But I think more importantly, they could end up having their lives interfered with in a massive way, which would be a dose of karmic justice for the way that they have tried to destroy the lives of several other people in the hobby. So that's the summary of the topic. Do you guys want to jump in here and tell me if there's anything I missed or what you think, or how do you think this is going to go?
Well, I've tangled legally with Steve Jackson Games before, and I wouldn't recommend it. They're very on the ball and seem to know what they're about when it comes to contract law and so on. So I don't much fancy their chances. Bill Webb did put a statement out, which is repeated or screen captured or something on 10 Cars Tavern, which you can go and read. And he seems to apologize and kind of admit a little bit of guilt, saying, I behaved inappropriately. Yeah, that's all he says, but it's never usually a good idea to apologize to these kinds of people, in my opinion, because it does no good. It doesn't get you any forgiveness, and it just makes you look guilty. But it doesn't seem like that would interfere with this legal case at all. So there's that.
Yeah, that's right, because the tortious interference, that won't be affected. The fact that they interfered with the contract, I mean, he could be guilty of far worse than what they accuse him of, but it wouldn't really matter, because the issue is that their interference in this contract. Someone from the chat pointed out Myers versus Mark Wade is a similar case also happening in Texas. Myers being the guy behind the Diversity in Comics YouTube channel, and Mark Wade, a comic artist who interfered with a deal Myers had made with Antarctic Press, I believe, to publish the comic that he'd gotten together for a Kickstarter. And in that case, Antarctic Press dropped him, and so he's got a very strong case for damages there. In this case, Steve Jackson Games has, Bill Reed, who's the current CEO of Steve Jackson Games, has come out basically, Texas strong, defending that he's going to continue. That he doesn't feel that there's anything about this situation that merits stopping the business dealings between Steve Jackson and the Frog God Games, which to me is a real sign that Steve Jackson is one of the good ones,
Yeah, they've always been a more conservative company. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but in a creative field that does tend to be more the other way. So I guess it's not that surprising. Plus, they've got the money to do something like this, which a lot of role-playing game companies don't. So sooner or later, someone was going to get their comeuppance, I guess, when it comes to this.
If we remember our history, Steve Jackson is a fairly outspoken libertarian, and he is a guy who got himself raided by the FBI at one point in his business, right? When the FBI raided his offices when he was writing the cyberpunk source book for GURPS. And I imagine that something like that can tend to incline one to not want to deal with censors, and to be more willing to stand up to those sorts of shenanigans.
Going back to Bill Webb's statement, which I read on 10 Cars Tavern, I think he apologized there because, as he stated it, there wasn't anything really to apologize for. He put his arm around like a colleague or a former employee, called her sweetie, and then offered her a cigarette that happened to have his license and his hotel key in there, which he claims that she took as like some sort of pass to have sex with her or something, even though his wife and kids were in the hotel room, like waiting for him. So, I mean, in that case, I think he was right to apologize, because he just wants to clean the slate and get everything out on the table and be like, you know what? If I did do something bad, which a lot of people say I did, then okay, my bad. And then it just makes everybody that piles on look that much more ridiculous and that much more guilty of persecuting him unnecessarily because they don't like his politics, or because the culture war, or because they're so woke they can't wait to go broke. Take your pick.
It just seems odd because the accusations against Webb aren't that serious, at least the public ones that we've seen. He got drunk at a convention. If that got you barred from conventions in the UK, they would be completely empty. They'd just be like tumbleweed blowing across, because it's very much a drinking culture over here. And something that was subjectively interpreted as making a pass at someone. Yeah, it's not really a lot to go on. That's not something to cancel someone's career over. And Mensa, all he did was make some mildly inappropriate dirty old man comments to Jessica Price. That doesn't seem like it's something worth cancelling someone's career over, especially someone with such a long and distinguished career in gaming. The only serious one that we've had, and that's just the accusations, is the stuff against Zach. And there's not a lot of meat on those bones either.
I find that one a lot more credible. I mean,
and
because you've heard from other people involved in it, and
yeah.
But and it's about a pattern of abuse over years, right? These are about isolated incidents that happen in one moment.
Yeah.
And you can see that this is all basically about feminism run amok or something like that. But of course, there's another, there's an ulterior side to this as well, which is that in both cases it represents the extreme left in the RPG hobby, recognizing that the OSR is dangerous to them, right? It's because it's
dangerous to them.
That's right. It's not something they can control, right? And in the case of Menser, it was a chance to go after one of the fathers, if you will, of, I've got this thing falling down here. It was going after one of the fathers of the hobby.
Pundit makes books that won't stand up.
Yeah, it's at an angle. All right. It's about going after one of the fathers of the hobby as part of this kind of iconoclasm year zero sort of mentality, right? Menser, unfortunately for him, in one sense, fortunately in another, is still alive. And so you can go after him in a way that you can't go after, these people would, if Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson were alive right now, they'd be going after them too for equally, ridiculous things. And Bill Webb is a known conservative, right? And so of course he's the enemy, right? They're going after him for the same reason that they go after me, at least. I don't know, not the two of you, I guess, because neither of you are exactly conservatives, but they're the enemy, right? So now if somebody else, if one of their own woke crowd had behaved this way towards women, which we all know that, SJW male feminist betas routinely do, they're the number one Me Too moment people, there probably would have been a whole other way that they would have approached this, right? And which is not to say that they wouldn't have devoured them too, right? But of course, for them, part of this is the agenda against conservatism, the agenda against the kind of free and open movement that is the OSR versus a movement that they can control. It's a little bit of all of those things.
Yeah, well, I saw they're trying to minimize your role in the consultancy as well. Now I saw that altercation you got into.
Yeah, they've done everything they can to try to pretend that I wasn't a consultant on 5th edition and that I wasn't as involved in it as I actually was.
Yeah, are those just isolated critical role apologists, or is there an actual movement?
No, the SJW crowd do it too.
Discredit you or not give you props for your consulting contribution to 5th edition.
No, it's absolutely something that the entire SJW crowd do. And the thing is, it's really interesting, right? Because remember, 4th edition was the preferred edition of the SJW crowd, right? Because most of the SJW crowd were also part of that pretentious kind of forged design movement. And it's not to say that they liked... Yeah, it's not that they like to play 4th edition. It's that 4th edition reduced D&D to what they always wanted it to be. Right, and it made D&D unsuccessful, which is another good side effect as far as they were concerned. Right,
a mindless board game. That's basically what it turned it into.
Yeah. So when 5th edition came out, if you look back, if you look at the record, originally all the SJW crowd, initially their tactic was to say that 5th edition is a terrible edition, that it's really bad, right, and that it's badly designed, that it's incoherent, that it's nowhere near as wonderful as 4th edition is. And that was the tactic they took at first. But when it became obvious relatively early on that 5th edition was going to be a big success, they couldn't do that because they needed to be entryists into 5th edition. So then the tactic changed to trying to appropriate 5th edition and say that it's theirs, right? And not something that was designed by people like me.
Plus, when 5th edition first came out, there were several nods to, there was that whole line about your character doesn't have to be the gender that you are, or doesn't have to be a specific gender at all, gender fluid or something like that. And then there was another line about sexuality, like your character could be gay or something. And I think those very few nods to the progressive woke culture of 2014 or whatever it was. I think that created enough something to keep the progressives from like hating it too much, and then a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, especially as it grew in popularity, and they're like, oh, I could be cool now if I'm a geek, or I can, hold my head high if I admit I play Dungeons and Dragons. Then they're like, yay, and then everybody dyed their hair blue and wore like black thick glasses and
Danger hair.
went on Twitter.
It's hard for people to criticize or enter a note of caution on any of this stuff, because then you'll instantly get branded a rape apologist or whatever else. I guess we're only really free to talk about it because we've already been burned.
Yes.
Well, I think people need to, and are increasingly learning that it really doesn't matter what these people call you or what they say, right? And the more that we recognize that they should just be ignored, the more things can come back to normal,
Yeah, it's most of it's so petty. So some guy gets drunk at a convention and gets into a mild altercation. They ban him from the con. That should be the end of it. An old man says something slightly inappropriate to a much younger woman. Tell him to fuck off and move on with your day. Really, that should be the end to it. And yet it's not. And it's a shame that the law has to get involved. Suing people has to get involved, but maybe that'll return some common sense and politeness to things. I don't know.
I think it does, though. I think at this point in time, the law does have to get involved, because otherwise there won't be a return to normalcy. I think one of the tipping points was Gary Con. Mentor lost his guest of honor status. Apparently he could still attend, but the Gary Con didn't want to give him the sort of validation or approval that would come from allowing him to keep his guest of honor status, which he's had for years and years, probably since the convention first started like 10, 11 years ago. And I think Bill Webb, the controversy was started with him. I think they were going to make him a guest of honor or some notable, he was going to be a big deal there. And there was a lot of pressure from Stacy and other people. And then he withdrew and just decided to back out. So Gary Con wouldn't be put in an awkward position of telling him to stay out or telling him like, yeah, you can come and we'll do it. And then catching all this heat, which probably wouldn't have been all that bad. It's just a very, very vocal minority on Twitter and other social media places that just runs their mouth. And so, yeah, that's good for Bill Webb and Ty Beard, and I hope they're successful. And I hope they start a precedent that all this shit won't keep happening.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll keep an eye on it, I'm sure, and let people know any further developments.
This is part of a larger social issue, which is that it's a question of rule of law, right? And the problem with the SJW left in general is that they have felt like they could act with impunity, like they were completely above the law. And in some cases they have been, because local law in many places has made that clear to them, right? That you can break someone's skull with a bike lock and get off, right? You don't do prison time, right? So you can say almost anything you want to about someone if you're on the left in social media, because the social media sites will protect you, right? And they'll in fact ban the people that you tell them to ban. So I think that one of the big turning points has been actually after the Covington Catholic incident, when the families of those schoolboys that were falsely accused of being racist intimidators of that guy, that Native American guy, who was in fact the one that was the aggressor there, and the media painted them all as a bunch of little white supremacists or something like that. They banded together. They hired some very high-powered lawyers and are now suing all the major media channels and everybody who was involved, right? And this is, I think this has got to be the answer. And I think we're going to see a lot more of these tortious interference suits in the United States that are going to make sure to let these people know that there are consequences, actual legal consequences to their attempts to violate rule of law, which is, a really good thing.
I don't think we've got much more to say on this topic, have we? Should we sort of segue into the Twitter drama?
All right, let's move on.
So we were sent some screenshots by a fan of the show, Mr. Triceratops, of a Christina Ariel. Don't go and harass her. She apparently plays in a lot of these stream games and so on. And she was recounting this story that we've heard many different versions of before. We were talking pre-show, and I said it's almost an urban legend, the kind of woke gamer girl or whatever that runs into some gamers and feels dismissed or whatever. So yeah, she was in a store. She heard dice rolling, ducked her head round the corner, and the guys there, to my perception, from what she wrote, they sounded like they were kind of self-conscious and wanted to be welcoming and were a bit over-enthusiastic because they started explaining to her what they were doing. I'm a dungeon master, we're playing a role-playing game, we each play one of these characters. And yeah, she's got all these kind of digital blackface response gifs in this tweet thread that she's got. Is it saying, yeah, I know what it is. I'm a gamer girl. Satine is my dungeon master. No, sort of thing. And we see this kind of story all the time. And there's a marked divide in how people react to these stories. You've got lots of women going, you go girl, sort of thing. A lot of guys just kind of not understanding what the fuss is about, saying, well, you were near them. They were self-conscious about what they were doing. They wanted to be welcoming. They wanted to be enthusiastic. So they started explaining what they were doing to you. Why did you react so negatively? I don't understand why that would be received negatively. It just seemed to me like they were trying to be welcoming. We seem to hear variations of this story week in, week out, all year long. I'm just wondering why there's this disconnect when you want to be welcomed into the community, when you want to be accepted, when you want people to be enthusiastic about bringing people into the game, and yet when they try to do that, you react by dissing them and doing a shame thread on Twitter. If this incident ever happened, I'm sure things like this do happen all the time, but it just always seems to be that the guys in the story try to be welcoming and enthusiastic, and they just get burned. And if someone was that superior at them, I think they'd get bummed out and less likely to be welcoming in the future. So go on, Veggie.
If I were to hazard a guess about why that is, I think it's, to some degree, everybody hates stereotypes or being stereotyped, even though it's so reasonable and logical and convenient sometimes. But the left apparently really hates stereotypes. And you can't blame these guys. 99 times that a woman has come up to them and looked at them while they were playing and either asked directly, like, what are you guys doing? Or just like looked at them like they were from Mars. They would have to explain, like, oh, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then she just looks at you with this blank face, like, you just told me whatever it was in Latin. Like, I don't know what that is. And then they would have to explain, like, what Dungeons and Dragons is. And so 99 times that happens. And then one time, the girl, like, maybe knows Dungeons and Dragons more than they do. And, like, oh, how dare they stereotype me as a girl that might not know what Dungeons and Dragons is in 2019 or whatever. It's why get mad over that? It's a stereotype. It happens a lot. Just be like, like, oh yeah, actually, I know exactly what Dungeons and Dragons is, and then work on your communal love of Dungeons and Dragons instead of making this big thing of like, oh my god, how dare they not realize, or how dare they not give me the benefit of the doubt?
Yeah, I mean, and why not?
Knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons was this special like intersectional privilege state that if it is not assumed, then you're automatically cast into the fiery pit or something like that.
Yeah, why not jump right in at the start? So the guy says, "Oh, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's what's called a role-playing game." And you jump in then and say, "Yeah, I know it's great. I play it all the time. I do it on this." Yeah,
Right.
geek out together. Why sit there and let the guy mansplain to you for ages?
Yeah, it's like they're like she's baiting them. Like,
Yeah, this is
like dig yourself a deeper hole, so then I can like rub it in your face even harder. You know,
to
just
me.
like a
To me,
woman.
this is a ridiculous non-issue, except for the one thing, which was how this person Ariel, how she reacted to this. And it sure seems like it has this agenda that we see in the SJW gamer entryists, which is to suggest that, regular nerds are somehow a toxic problem, right? Because they really, these people say they like RPGs, but they seem to hate most RPGs and most people who have played RPGs for more time than they have, right? But really, the natural thing that any normal human being would have done at this point when they came in and they were like, oh, well, that you could criticize to some extent these gamers for saying, well, there's a woman in a game shop, she must not have any idea what she's talking about. Sure, okay, but the natural reaction that most people would have would be to immediately say, yeah, I know D&D. I'm actually a live D&D live streamer and have done all this stuff, right? But instead, she didn't do that, right? Like, I mean, I'm a guy, I do not look in terms of dress and what have you like a typical gamer, certainly not like a typical North American gamer, right? I don't even wear T-shirts, right? I certainly don't wear T-shirts with nerdy logos on them or something like that, right? So if I go into a gaming store, I could imagine a scenario where I might be mistaken for just being like, I don't know, somebody's dad who wandered in there or something, and that somebody might try to do the same thing with me, right? And my first reaction wouldn't be to be outraged at them mistakenly thinking I'm not a gamer. It would be,
dare you? I am the RPG
to say,
pundit.
well, what? Actually, I'm the RPG pundit, and then proceed from there. Yeah, you like that 5th edition you're playing there? You're welcome, but this is, so the issue here is, to me, not the way these guys acted, which you could at most make a very minor criticism of kind of assuming that she wasn't a gamer. It was the way that she is reacting to that, right? Which is obviously based on having an agenda.
It's in the thread of replies to her thread. There is this stark gender divide. The women all seem to think the guys were being horrible or exclusionary or patronizing, and the men commenting on the thread are all trying to say, hey, they were just being friendly and trying to explain what they were doing and so on. So the women in the hobby, or at least that follow her, it's just really marked and stark how they've taken the most negative possible interpretation of events, while the guys have taken the more positive interpretation of events.
How is the human race going to continue? Like, I can imagine, just based on women on Twitter, that the marriage rate is going to drop like 80%.
It already
2020, and just like nobody's getting married, nobody's having kids, nobody's having sex, because
Venger, it already had.
The genders can't stand each other.
Statistically,
a new gender, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 17th gender for people to like navigate, because men and women, it's just like scorched earth. Like,
Venger, statistically, this already has happened. The millennials are statistically the generation that have had the least amount of sex.
I knew it.
context than any living generation, basically, right? I mean, I think they've had more sexual activity maybe than the greatest generation, but the greatest generation got married really young, right? And then, did that, right? But like, there is a huge crisis that is happening all over the Western world of, incredibly declining birth rates, right?
I just created that shit with my mind, yo.
This is part of a very serious problem, right? That the collapse of the standard kind of ideas of male-female relations have created a situation where, people are just not just that it's not that they don't want to have kids, though certainly there are quite a lot of them that have been brainwashed into thinking they don't. But that people are literally incapable of being able to form normal relations, romantic relationships with other people. This is an extent of something that we're already seeing in a very big way in Japan, for example, who I guess they're always like, Japan lives 10 years in the future or something. I don't know why, but they do, right? And they have this complex of what they call herbivore men, right? Which is the fact that young Japanese men simply have just given up on dating, having sex, or anything like that at all, right? And the Japanese women have this huge problem that they can't actually find anybody who wants to date them because the men have just said, oh, well, it's just not worth trying, And I think in North America and in Europe, you're going to see the same thing. You're already seeing the same thing, but you're going to see it getting worse before it gets better, unless there's a huge culture shift.
Which there will be, right? The generation that's coming after the millennials is going to, the pendulum is going to swing the other way.
Yeah, there's already indications that the Zoomers are gonna be, they're our last best hope. Sometimes I think we're like, the remnants of the Jedi, and we're trying to find the new generation that'll stand up to these imperial fuckers. Mm-hmm. So a couple of comments here from people in the audience before we proceed. There's somebody saying, E.S. Taylor says, a good Catholic woman yearns for her man's loins. All right. I'll leave that to those who are married to Catholics to confirm or deny. Bootface says, it's such an open-ended hobby. There's literally no excuse to domain about the lack of representation or the lack of X identity. Calvin DeJordy says also, religious people have the best sex. This is proven through multiple studies. Well, I guess it depends on what you define as the best sex. They probably are having the most consistent amounts of sex,
And which religion?
Married, and then they're told to have lots of kids, right?
If you're having missionary sex through a hole in the sheet, then I doubt.
Yeah, but that's not actually what happens, I guess Mormons do it in underwear, but other than that, Calvin DeJordy also says, I agree with Pundit where he says, I love it when people say that. I agree with Pundit where he says that the solution to this is more masculinity. The lack of women is the reason for the lack of men.
I think we'll use robot drones to artificially inseminate people using super soakers. I think that's how we'll.
I see. E.S. Taylor says, stay away from soy crap, eat more meat. Bootface says, more Hyperborean space strippers.
Yes.
Buried Axlade says, barefoot and pregnant, the RPG. Calvin DeJordy says, Grim is kink shaming, lol.
As if I ever would.
Maybe some people like through the sheet sex, yeah. All right, so anything else to say about that, or should we move on to DMing styles?
I think we can move on.
Yeah, so this is your topic, Venja.
Okay. All right. First, I'm not going to bore you with a whole lot of detail, but I started working with clay a little over a week ago, and I created some things. My first ever clay Cthulhu.
Oh, look at that.
So
wow, that looks pretty good and everything.
Yeah, it's not too bad for my first real attempt. Like, I played around with clay like a few years ago, and it was kind of a disaster. I just like rage quit. I was just like, fuck this. But but the
So
other day,
apparently-
I went back and I'm like, you know what? Even if I know I'm gonna suck, and I'm just gonna keep doing it until I create something that doesn't suck. No matter how long it takes. And it took me about 3 hours, but I created that, and then for the longest time, I wanted like a dice roller, like a dice tower. I mean, and this is like a dice slide / dice tunnel. It's got tentacles on it, some glowing runes back there. So you put your dice up here, and then they slide down most of the time. So that was something fun I did.
Sorry to interrupt.
At some point.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you're just joining us, you are watching the Inappropriate Characters Arts and Crafts channel with Venture Satanis.
Okay, so my topic at hand. This was a blog post that I've been meaning to write and been thinking about a little bit. I wanted to narrow it down to 3 main types of game masters. So first, I've got the Dungeon Master from the D&D cartoon in the 80s. Zeus from Clash of the Titans, like the original 1981 movie. And I was trying to come up with a third one, and I came up with the Wizard of Oz. So very briefly, I'll just mention like a little bit about each one, and then you guys can like discuss or whatever. Okay, so the Dungeon Master, he's kind of like a neutral arbiter, informing the PCs like what's going on in the world, rumors, and providing hints and laying the foundation groundwork for the scenario that the PCs are going to be on. And then there's Zeus, who seems very fair and objective, but definitely has an influence. And he exerts that influence, and you can see that here and there in very subtle ways, but it is there. He plays by the rules, but they're definitely his rules. And the third, the Wizard of Oz, basically talks about how great he is, how great and powerful, how awesome, embellishing his NPCs, and just basically lording over how awesome he is to the players and their characters. Knowing myself and knowing many other game masters who I've played under and read about and see online, I think those 3 types are like what I normally see. I would say myself as more like Zeus from Clash of the Titans. So you guys can critique that or go or whatever.
Well, it's certainly an interesting model of game master styles that you've set up there. I've never quite thought about it in terms of pop culture references for game masters. I think that it would depend on what campaign I'm running, but I think that I'd be, depending on which game I'm running, I'm either a BBC documentary presenter or Hunter S. Thompson, getting my players all high and tripped out or something like that.
Yeah, Hunter S. Thompson would maybe be a 4th one.
Yeah. Certainly my Gonzo campaigns are basically a Hunter S. Thompson trip. I think that what you're saying though is basically that the game master styles can be where the game master is a completely neutral figure that only provides the scene, which is frankly, from my point of view, the right way to DM, right? That he creates the world and then lets that world work on its own. And it's when I talk about RPGs, it's what I call the clockmaker god, which is this idea that comes out of, Enlightenment deism, that God is not this guy that goes around throwing thunderbolts at people, but rather he was the one that created the universe and set everything into motion like a set of, like a machine, like a set of gears, and then is just there allowing these things to go through on their own, or then your second option is basically a guy who is a DM that has an agenda that he's interfering to push towards certain concepts, which I consider to be sometimes okay, but it can really depend, because it's very easy to get out of hand with that, right? Where you end up essentially doing light or heavy railroading. And then the Wizard of Oz would be the definition of the illusionist GM, where he's got a story that he wants to tell, and he's just kind of making the players just be kind of witnesses to that story, whether they know that or not, right? And so like they might think they have choices, but they really don't. And much like the Wizard of Oz, at some moment, most players will end up looking behind the curtain and realizing that the whole thing is a sham, and then fucking off back to Kansas.
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
I think you're all right with that one. My GMing style, if I had to peg it to a pop culture figure, I think it'd be the smoking man from X-Files. Machiavellian, sort of trying to manipulate and maneuver various aspects of play towards the end that I want, but not doing it so directly. And
Zeus from Clash of the Titans.
He's a bit more overt, I think, and a bit.
The side question, which is very relevant here, do you ever fudge rolls, or maybe not fudge them, but you think up like a rationale, like maybe after the dice have rolled, you're like, well, even though it was a 13 and technically needed a 15, like you probably should have gotten a +2 bonus for this thing over here because of that, and I'll give it to you. Maybe you don't say that. Maybe it's just like all in your head, but
yeah, maybe very slight fudging. I don't do sort of over all out fudging. I think the dice should still play an important role, but I might interpret what has been rolled slightly differently, one way or the other, towards my goal, my end. So
that's a bit of an incomplete question, because the question shouldn't be, do you fudge dice rolls, yes or no? It's, if you fudge dice rolls, what kind of dice rolls are you fudging? Because there's a very big difference between fudging a dice roll in a combat, for example, to say, well, you probably should have hit this guy, or he should probably have hit you, so I'm just going to pretend that I rolled a 15 instead of a 13. Versus the place where I do think a DM can fudge dice rolls is if you're playing this clockmaker god DM, who is basically not trying to actively direct the world. One of the things you have to rely on is an element of randomness to simulate a living world. So you're going to use a lot of random tables. And where I do sometimes fudge dice rolls is in that, where I will rely on the table itself to kind of give me an idea of what's going on, but then I will try to modify the random result of a random encounter, or a random thing that's there, or what have you, to be a better fit to the world as I already know it. And that's a kind of fudging that is, I think, completely acceptable. Whereas I would never, if they're fighting a goblin or something and the goblin gets a critical and that's going to kill a player character, I won't fudge that. That's what should happen, and he should die, and that's it.
It can be a bit annoying if you've got this big villain or something set up and they immediately crit and kill them or something. Though, you never get your soliloquy. They never get to show off how impressive they actually are. So yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's why we're not story gamers. We're playing a living world, and in a living world, crazy shit happens. And that, in the long run, that's for the benefit of everyone, because the players know that it's a world where the things that they manage to do actually matters, right?
Yeah, I think that's
pundits very much the dungeon master type 1, and then I think Grim and I are very much the type 2, Zeus, who has kind of not an agenda or a story, but certain desires or drives or aesthetics that if something is on the edge, like, why not, just like breathe on it or just tap it a little bit to make it, one way or the other, if you definitely want it to, occur that way. And maybe it's not always to the player's advantage. Maybe, sometimes if you're feeling a little bit naughty or justice, if the player who's expecting a bonus and has been kind of like playing like a dick the whole time, maybe his karma return is like he reaches for that sword and like and it just happens to go in his wrist at the exact same moment and like fucks up the sword for him or something. I don't know.
No, I disagree. And ultimately, there's only two real DMs.
You are the pundit.
Yeah, well, I was going to say there's only really ultimately two DMing styles: the pundit style and the wrong style. Some comments from the audience here. The Schwartz says, "Whoa, that dice thing is awesome."
Thank
Aaron RPA says, "Damn it, Benjer, I told you not to sculpt my ex-wife."
Let me see if I can fit in this thing.
E.S. Taylor says, "I think the cartoon DM is the most common. We all like to think we're Zeus, but..." What else have we got here? John Simon says, "Roll 1d6 for which style is appropriate."
Wow, that
Calvin
seems...
Calvin the Jordy says, "I think there's some more games. There are some game systems that lend better or less. That lend better for less or more controlling DMs." E.S. Taylor says, "Hunter S. Thompson would be very random table-ish." Well, yeah, that's why I associate them. Dracopol says, "I often say that the DM has a God/Hitler complex, but that's okay because the players have a worshiper/Poland complex."
Oh man,
there are dickish dungeon masters as well. I don't know. You might call them fifth dimensional imps, I suppose. Yeah, they're just there to fuck with the players.
Yeah, the DM is a power trip. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's over the Wizard of Oz. Type.
It fits into that, of course, because a power tripping DM will be a story gaming illusionist DM. The Schwartz says, "The smoking man, love it." What else have we got here? Calvin Majority says, "I think you can have railroaded beats for the story, but you need a ton of freedom between those points, and maybe those points morph into something different that still is the same narrative device." John Simon says, "Time as a resource is important, I guess." Calvin DeJordy says, "I think the expectation that a more rigid system like D&D will always deliver enamoring content is pretty absurd." Well, what I would respond to that, Calvin, is that the problem is still with people thinking that you say there's a difference between coming in with a story you want to make and then trying to force D&D to do that. D&D is not a good game system, and no RPG, no normal RPG is a good game system for that. Trying to make story as it's going along, which again, there's nothing in D&D that is good for that, or in most RPGs, versus what RPGs are made for, which is that you have to create a virtual world, have the players immerse in it, proceed through that story, and try to make as much of a sense of that living world with the characters, the NPCs, the agendas of things happening, the timeline progressing. And then what you end up with at the end of all that is this kind of story as a byproduct. But that's not really the goal. The goal is the experience of playing in a living world itself. And I don't know if that really segues us into the next topic here. But I don't know if you...
What about the game master who, as he's running the game, he sees what the players see, and then he knows like one or two things beyond their vision. And while you're running the game, things are going to come to you, maybe that you didn't know before, or you didn't realize, or you're going to put some dots together that's maybe you didn't when you were sketching it out like 3 or 4 hours ago, or maybe you're seeing something like you merged like two published scenarios together, and you see a hidden connection. I think I would see it as my duty as the game master that if I see a potentially better story, like right around the corner, if I kind of like tweak things or made things more obvious, or shined a light here or there, and kind of brought everything together. Maybe more cohesion or more cinematic or whatever. I'm going to do that, and I think that's going to make the game better. That's my prerogative as a game master, and I feel it's kind of my duty as I see that, if it's going to improve the game, to go on that path. Not everybody's going to agree, but that's my philosophy.
Well, here's what I would say about that. I think there's a very fine line between two different things that can happen when you're DMing. One of which is not right and the other one is right. And the one that's not right is that while you're DMing, you suddenly think, oh, well, it might be more cool if instead of the world being like this, it was like that. And that's not good, because then you as the DM are not getting into the context of immersing in the living world itself. You're just trying to re-edit the world. You're God coming back and rewriting stuff, right? And it's especially bad, of course, if what you're doing ends up clashing with the character's pre-existing experience of the world. But it's still bad even if that isn't what happens. But the thing that is good and that does work is if you're so immersed in that living world that you suddenly have an understanding of other things that are happening in the world that were not something you'd already decided, and they're not something that you already had, but they're something that you add to the world that is a natural, organic outproduct of the world as you already know it, right? And then that can be very cool, because that's when, the world is getting away from you in a way, right? The difference is, are you trying to control the game world, or is the game world taking on a life of its own and you're just suddenly discovering stuff about it you had no idea, right? Like, to me, the most exciting experience as a DM is when stuff happens, when suddenly you have an NPC say something or an event takes place that you as the DM had no idea was about to happen, right? But it happens completely because you've gotten so into playing the world that happens by itself, right? That kind of state of immersion into the world itself is the coolest moment for me whenever I'm DMing. And that's something that tends to only happen when you're running a really long campaign, right? Where the world has had so much time to develop that it starts revealing things to you that you didn't consciously know.
Yeah, and it's more common for players than for games masters to get that.
Well, right, because the player only has to immerse in one thing, their character, and then experience the world. The DM has to kind of let his own consciousness go and become the world.
Yeah, which does segue nicely into our last topic, which is realism. Shall I sort of sketch out my thinking on that first?
Please do.
So it's an interesting goal to try and make a game realistic. We've talked before about genre emulation, and you can approach reality almost as a genre. So you're trying to emulate things so that they make sense. So that can be less heroic, but just because you've brought magical elements or monsters or whatever else into a game world doesn't mean it can't also be realistic in everything else that's grounded. So realism can be the living world that Pundit often talks about. It can be grounding in history or in known quantities when it comes to political and social dynamics and so on. When it comes to rules, it's outcomes of roles that and interactions between parts of the system that make sense when you apply them to your own experiences in the real world. So when someone gets shot, what happens in the real world, and is that reflected properly in the game, and what's the effect that has on the way that people play? Generally, if you're more realistic, then your game will tend to be more deadly, and so as a result, players will be more cautious and tactical rather than heroic. I think the big thing in making a game's mechanics realistic is probably granularity, because we notice in our day-to-day lives how small changes can make a big difference to results and so on. So I think you need a broader scale quite often, but not always, if you're going for realism via the rules. So it's kind of a tricky thing to define what you mean by realism, because you could argue that something like Game of Thrones is realistic, even though it has magic and with dragons and all the rest of it. It's still a fairly brutal world. It's a world in which the social dynamics and so on mostly make sense and don't throw us out. What do you guys think about realism? I mean, even in your sense of having an immersive world, Pundit, the rules don't necessarily lend themselves to realism. And are you talking more about internal consistency or trying to model history and reality, or at least one view of reality when it comes to your approach?
Right. Well, I always said, in some of my old blogs, I criticize and I still criticize the type of game designer or gamer that what they're looking for is to try to do realism in the sense of saying stuff like, well, the average flight speed of the African sparrow is such and such, so therefore, we have to reflect that accurately in the game world. And you see this especially come up for some, because of nerds, I guess. It comes up a lot with like what you could call gun porn, and this argument of stuff, like realistically, is a katana better than another sword or stuff like that, right? And I think that's just a complete waste of time, really, because an RPG can't model reality in that sense. I mean, you would require a rule book, larger than 50 phone books to do that, and it would be unplayable.
Hero system.
Yeah. The realism that we need
to do that a little bit. I mean, there's a reason why a dagger typically does less damage than like a battle axe or a greatsword.
But what you need there is an internal consistency in the world, right? And it has to be internal to the world and to the genre in which that world exists. So if you're playing high fantasy, the important thing is that it be able to emulate high fantasy and that the world reflect that you have this kind of, elements of great heroism and great power and that sort of thing. And if you're playing a grittier sort of world, it has to be a gritty and dangerous world, right? And you need to make sure that you're using the rule set that is right for the world and vice versa. Like one example of this is the Dungeon Crawl Classics game, which is a great game. It's absolutely gonzo fantasy, right? And when I was creating the world of The Last Sun, I took a real look at that, which I run with Dungeon Crawl Classics. I took a real look at the Dungeon Crawl Classics rules, and certain things became evident there, right? That this sort of world, you need to have it needs to be weird fantasy. It needs to have a lot of stuff that is strange. And then the trick is, when you're running a gonzo setting, is that it can't just be a cartoon, like a Looney Tunes setting where nothing makes sense. Everything in the world has to make sense. So you can have a group of, talking sloths that are running a narco trafficking ring, but you have to be able to, even if the players don't know why it makes sense, you have to have a context in your mind as the DM of how that came to happen and why, right? And for example, with the rules relating to clerics in that system, when you roll a fumble on your clerical casting check, you get divine disapproval, right? And you have to do some kind of minor penance or something like that. And I had a player that was really, he looked at DCC and he hated it because he thought it was not realistic, in the sense that it didn't, you're getting divine disapproval. The only thing that mattered was what you rolled on the die. So you could have been casting a spell for the holiest of purposes, in complete following with your god, and you could still just randomly get this divine punishment for it. And so I looked at that and I said, okay, well then what has to be the reality of this game world is that God is like a kind of machine that has gone insane, right? So then in the world of The Last Sun, God is a computer program that is faulty now and is not working properly. And so this is why clerics get random disapproval. And so you have to create that kind of internal consistency for your world. In the case of Game of Thrones, one of the reasons why we think it's more realistic than, say, Lord of the Rings or something like that, is that Lord of the Rings is modeled after myth, right? And then other game worlds like, Forgotten Realms or something like that tend to be modeled on literature, which is even worse because there's no real element of a sense of verisimilitude to it. It's all about crafting the right story. But Game of Thrones was inspired by history, not by literature. It was inspired by the War of the Roses, the same setting as Dark Albion, which is why you can run a very Game of Thrones style campaign with Dark Albion. And there you need to have a world where events and things that happen model history. And in history, you have stuff like, I mean, during the War of the Roses, right? You had Richard of York, who looks like he's the hero of the story and is going to become the one true king and whatever. And then he makes one stupid decision in a battle and gets himself killed, right? And events proceed from there, right? Like people randomly die for stupid reasons. And the reason Game of Thrones feels realistic to us when we watch it or when we read the novels is that sort of stuff happens, right? You think, oh, well, you know, if you're thinking of it as literature, when in the first season, you think, oh, well, Ned Stark is obviously the hero of this story and he's going to uncover the, you know, like you predict it all based on what you know from fantasy novels, right? He's going to uncover the conspiracy. He's going to get into a lot of trouble, but then he's going to like reveal it and he's going to be the hero guy. And no, he gets double crossed and beheaded, right? And the story proceeds. So it's part of what I was saying about how a good RPG campaign, to a certain extent, has to be less like a story and more like a history, right? What happens is you're creating history based on events that happen in your game world.
What about you, Venji? You don't strike me necessarily as someone that's a huge fan of realism, unless maybe it's Call of Cthulhu.
I like a certain amount of realism. If I were to boil it down,
Venture thinks Call of Cthulhu is
kind of an interesting topic. And as you guys are talking, I'm kind of like thinking and writing things down. But I'm kind of pro realism up to a point. But maybe my idea of realism is a little more abstract. Like, you know, like we don't need 40 different types of handgun, you know, each with like 0.2 modifier, you know, difference in order to gauge like how real is this game. But if I was going to boil it down, which I am, I'd go with internal consistency, brutality, and what I'm calling now mundane tedium, which there's probably a better name for that third one, but I've yet to come up with it. So basically, we all know what internal consistency is. You know, the sky isn't black one day and purple the next, unless there's like a reason behind it somewhere, even if the players don't know. Brutality, the world's got to be somewhat harsh or not fair, or, you know, where the players are occasionally saying like, that's bullshit. Like, what the fuck? Otherwise, there's not much to struggle against. And it's like in the Matrix, like people are just going to start waking up from the program because it's like a utopia. Things are too easy. Everything is like coming to them right away, and there's nothing to struggle against. And it doesn't seem real. And then the mundane tedium is just like, you know, things you don't necessarily want to talk about or think about in a game. And I wouldn't dwell on these, but I would present them like here and there as little tidbits, maybe, or little minor challenges, you know, that's going to preoccupy them for like a couple minutes before the next big challenge or discovery or exploration or what have you. Things like taxes, like
resource management,
water in your canteen, you know, trying to conserve ammo, like how many rounds do you have left, like how many charges are left on your wand, you know, things like that. Like all those three things I think are necessary if you want kind of realism in the game.
It sounds to me like what you're talking about is resource management, which is, for example, a very important part of old school D&D, right? Where you have to keep track of your arrows, you have to get the food rations, you have to have all that stuff, right?
That's part of it, but I'm also thinking of like at some point your character's probably gonna have to go to the bathroom, or you know, if the king is mad, then there's got to be someone with a drool cup that like sits under his chin as he's like gibbering and drooling all over himself. Things like that. It's like, that's not very heroic or cinematic or like epic or fucking awesome. But yet at the same time, if you have little details like that, it makes your world seem more real, and people can become more immersed in it because it seems real or realer than it was before. Anyway, I will blog about this. I gotta go. Past my bedtime, but great show, guys.
All right.
Anything you want to share first?
And thank you to our audience members and everyone that commented and chatted with us. That was cool. So yeah, good stuff. See ya.
All right. See you later.
I think that one of the things that tie into what Benjer is saying is it also connects to this idea of the game world as a living world rather than as a backdrop for stories, which is that I think it's very important in the game world that there has to be times where the PCs don't automatically have something to do. And you see this sometimes in gamers who are used to only game worlds that act as a backdrop for this, DM-driven story, that they when something like that happens, they have no idea how to take their own initiative, and they're kind of like waiting for the next, dark stranger to appear and give them a quest, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what they're used to. Like, they're used to being driven by the nose to the next adventure. And if you're running a game that's a living world, there's going to be sometimes where you might run into someone who will present you with an opportunity to do that. And sometimes you kind of have to go out and do it yourself, right? And that's a very important part of creating a world that feels alive. That there's, you don't always have somebody just showing up and presenting you with either the problem or the solution.
Yeah, and there can be stuff going on that isn't important. Yeah, like almost like extras in the background of a show rather than fully fledged NPCs. Just little vignettes of things happening. Like, they're at market and a chicken has escaped from one of the stalls, and the stall owner is chasing it, up and down the cobbles or whatever. Just little things, little scenes, little moments you can throw into the background and embellish the descriptions.
It's very important also that if interactions with even very minor NPCs, that as the DM you try to have something, some notion of incarnating that NPC as a person and not just as like the video game guy that stands there and waits for you to say something and then gives a pre-programmed response, right? Like give if you can give your shopkeeper even some minor note of personality, whatever it might be, then that shopkeeper becomes more alive, and that makes the world seem more alive.
Yeah,
so that's definitely correct.
I think we're pretty much on the same page on this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think likely we are. I've got some comments here from the audience that we could take a look at.
Yeah.
Dracopol says, what long-term effect will it have on tabletop RPGs if it's permeated by the SJW attitude that the world revolves around their young, untested opinions? A game setting should advance on its own. Well, I think that there's a very good point in that. That it is part of the problem, something I've called, the Seattle 2018 setting issue, where you have people that have a very limited worldview and that then demand that every game setting fit that worldview. And so you end up with like every D&D setting looks like, basically like a fantasy version of Seattle in 2018, right? And you've seen Wizards of the Coast transform through its adventures, the worlds that it's set in, mostly the Forgotten Realms, into that, right? Where Waterdeep is now, downtown Seattle in the modern era, right? Which just has, with elves and magic. So this is it's a destruction of the possible diversity of worlds that you can have.
Add some unintended consequences. If they're expecting the world to conform to one particular point of view, and in their adventures they're trying to bend it that way, you can always react. If everywhere's fantasy Seattle, then every magic shop is going to turn into a Starbucks at some point. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The Starbucks setting is another way to put it. Yeah. John Simon says, I would go by coherent, not realistic.
Yeah. the word's not coming to mind at the moment. There's a term I use. But it's not coming to mind. Which basically just means, internally consistent. As long as it makes sense in and of itself, that's the important part.
Calvin the Geordie says, I think it's important to present a world that your players can make reasonable assumptions about how common and mundane things work. The fantastical elements should be consistent enough to not bog down the experience. Well, yeah, that's true. They should have an idea as characters in that world of how normal things work, how normal society works. And so part of it is when you're presenting a setting, you need to, as the DM, tell your players, because their characters are part of that world, that they should understand things like, for example, the social mores of that setting.
Yeah.
And as far as the fantasy elements, that's right. Also, you have to explain what the context of stuff like magic and monsters are in that world, and how the average person would view them.
I think it's often easier to kind of introduce elements of the game world, culture, and so on as you go along, rather than having one big data dump right at the start, or expecting them to, read and remember every single detail of a section on the game world or the culture. Those kind of teachable moments are better ways of getting it into people's heads and allowing them to remember it through the incident in the game. Plausibility is the word I was groping for before.
There we go. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And like, for example, when I'm running Dark Albion or, the Lion and Dragon in whatever medieval setting I'm running it in, because especially their players who are used to playing D&D in like Greyhawk or the Realms or something like that, think that they're basically acting like 21st century Americans. Instead of just trying to like, at the beginning, tell them everything that I can about medievalism, what I do is say, okay, well, this is your character, right? And then as they go along, if they, run into a priest, or they run into, they go to the court of some noble, or they're in some kind of situation in a city or a town or whatever, there are moments where I will pause to tell them out of character, look, your character in this situation, he would know that he would be expected to act in this way, or to do this, or to not do this, right? And then you can decide if you go ahead with that or not. But understand that for your character, this would be the norm, and you can then decide whether you deviate from the norm or not.
Yeah, it's just it's much easier to do it piecemeal, and it tends to stick in people's brains better that way, I think.
Yeah. E.S. Taylor says, Seattle does have a lot of fecal matter on the sidewalks, just like a medieval city. Yeah, I don't know. I think that one of the greatest evidences of the flaws of the kind of Seattle, Portland, San Francisco triangle of leftist governance is that all of those cities are now covered in literal crap. Dracopol says, in quotes, the gold I worked so hard for in the dungeon might be stolen because this is a sanctuary city.
You guys, you're gonna ruin my leftist cred.
Yeah, you're kind of screwed here, because I don't think that I'm guessing the vast majority of our audience are not pro-Remain. Mr. Triceratops says the villain is an RPG Twitch streamer. Buried Axeblade says intelligence checks for knowing stuff outside of the culture you grew up in. Yeah, well, that's a good point, is that also as characters travel more afield, of course, you should end up having them be less familiar with things. Whereas if they're playing in their own, the place where their character comes from, the DM should give them all the resources they need about what they would know about the world.
Mm. See, D&D can't help but be very left-wing, I think, because it's all about redistributing wealth from dragon hordes to blacksmiths. And yeah.
I've always argued, I've said this, I think, on the show before, is that the leftist narrative about why D&D is toxic is that it's a claim that it's, representative of imperialist, colonialist, white nationalists that go out into orc country and massacre orcs that represent, non-white people or something like that. But I think that that's just a ridiculous way to interpret it, when in fact the right way of looking at this is that a D&D party is a group of racially and culturally diverse people from a variety of backgrounds that come together to protect helpless people against dangerous creatures that are generally, genocidal and speciesist,
We got any other comments, or shall we just shill and wrap up?
Well, I wanted to mention one thing that I saw today. It's completely off topic, but apparently we are now in a situation in the world where it's about a year advance of what was predicted originally, but it was coming for a long time. We're now 50% of the world's population is classifiable as being middle class or higher. And middle class here is defined in a very broad sense as being able to have an income that allows for regular, additional or, personal spending besides the basic necessities. Right? And I think that that's quite a remarkable achievement that is entirely thanks to Western civilization. And when you couple that with the fact that now only 10% or less of the world is in extreme or abject poverty, which is definable by the UN as having making $2 a day or less. This is an incredible achievement for humanity, right? Because when you think about 100 years ago, 90% of the world was in extreme poverty, right? And really that shift, the big shift that happened was after the end of the Cold War, right? After basically the Soviet model collapsed and you saw the spread of capitalism to a number of places in the third world. And that's what's accounting for this big shift, right? Like, after decades of people throwing money in aid programs in Africa to very little effect, what's actually changed the demographics of wealth levels in places like Africa has been massive investment. And that's a huge deal.
Or Chinese imperialism, as it's otherwise known.
Yeah, but it's something that has, raised all boats, so to say. And I think that it's really interesting how people tend to, like, one of the great criticisms of, the Western model and capitalism in particular is this idea of wealth disparity, right? But, the fact that, okay, there is a 1% of people that are insanely wealthy is much less important in terms of overall well-being of humanity than the fact that now 50% of the human race, billions of people, have discretionary spending on a regular basis, right? That's incredible. That's never happened before in the history of humanity, right? And I just wanted to point that out to the audience as to show that, the capitalist model, it's done exactly what it was supposed to do. You might disagree as the resident leftist, I don't know. But.
Well, from my point of view, you need prosperity in order to have the capacity in the economy to invest socially in welfare systems, in education, in health, and so on, all of which act as force multipliers for quality of life and free spending and so on. So I'm not one of those really sort of hardline, death to capitalism stuff. I think the best approach is a mixed economy. So you're not going to find a huge amount of disagreement, but I think that positive force that capitalism can be has to come with a counterbalance and a force that sees to it that the benefits are more evenly distributed than they might otherwise be, at least for a societal baseline.
Fair enough. But I think that the demographic evidence is showing that is exactly what's happening, right? And I mean, of course, there's room for social programs and all of that, and that's really good. But mainly my basic point is that, the people that go around, the same people that hate the OSR and hate D&D and hate gamers are the people that hate Western civilization, right? And this is a huge feather in the cap of Western civilization as the force that has created the models that has allowed for the first time the vast majority of humanity to live beyond abject poverty. Because it never, ever happened before under any other model.
Yeah. And now that you have some spare money, you should spend it on the things that me and Pundit and Venture make.
Haha, that's right. So, you got something to shill first here?
Nothing new particularly. I've nearly finished primary writing on actual fucking monsters. And because development tends to move quickly in self-publishing and so on, you probably see it come out around the middle of next month. If you want an early sneak peek, then you should back me on Patreon, and I'll make the sort of rough draft text files available to people there.
There you go. Good stuff. So as for me, well, I'm continuing to work on the RPG Pundit Presents series. The first compilation volume, which will be the first medieval authentic volume, is going to be coming out sometime soon, but I can't yet say when. That depends on my publisher, Presses Intermedia. But I can tell you that it is being worked on and progress is being made. I've seen the cover. It looks fantastic. It's also going to trigger a few people, but that's a plus. That's just a bonus.
Always a bonus.
Well, if you want to support me, I'm really at this point telling people not to go to my Patreon. But I mean, if you really want to send me money on Patreon, go right ahead. Send money to the Inappropriate Characters Patreon. Join that and back us here. If you want us to make more episodes, and if you want Venture to be able to stay up later, that would be a big plus. So go and back us on Inappropriate Characters, the Patreon there. The link should be in the description.
Yeah.
But as for me,
to subscribing here too.
Oh yes, please subscribe and share this video everywhere.
We need to get 1,000 subs.
If you want to back me personally, then check out the RPG Pundit Presents series and all of the there's now 75 different issues that have already come out. And there's bound to be something there that you can buy for anywhere between 99 cents to $3.99, I think, in PDF format that you will find useful in one of your games. The latest RPG Pundit Presents is RPG Pundit Presents number 75, The Bungalow of the Beach Giant Chiefs. And it is a throwback to a classic, module series from old school gaming in a very gonzo sort of way, where the player characters have to travel to the land of the beach giants and infiltrate the bungalow of the beach giant chief to stop a secret pact that he's trying to form with the stoned giants and the cloudy giants and the evil bears to invade the lands of men. So please take a look at that if it sounds like an adventure that you would like to have your players run. And if that doesn't sound right for you, then check out the other 74 issues, because you're bound to find something that you're going to like.
And I have a huge back catalogue, so go and raid that. Right, I guess we'll see everyone next month around this sort of time.
Unless you back us more on Inappropriate Characters, then it'll be sooner.
Yeah, then I will get even less sleep.
There we are. All right, so that's everything for today. Currently smoking Castello 4K Canadian with Image Latakia.
See you, everyone. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.